Yep. So the first thing is how do you build a consistent process into what you are doing every single day? So I think one of the things that most people do is they try to do a big fell swoop type of thing where, hey, we're going to do an hour on what meditation means, or we're going to do an hour on this day. And then you're not really using the principle of reinforcement to reinforce those different activities. That's why it's better for you to start small and start with how can we do a consistent habit. So one of the things I've worked with coaches on is to say, hey, we know that we're going to do 5 minutes every single day on a new topic, or we're going to do 5 minutes on how we begin and end every single practice, every single meeting with certain new things that we go through. Maybe it doesn't need to be 5 minutes. Maybe you want to start out with 1 to 2 minutes to keep it simple. But that's where you can use that time to reinforce whatever it is that you need to go through.
You are listening to the Bridging Impact Podcast, transforming leaders on and off the court with host, Coach Furtado. Without further ado, let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast. Today, I have Coach AJ on the pod. Coach AJ is a leadership and performance consultant. AJ, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to dive into our conversation on performance and then what really goes into that performance and talking about kind of the mental aspects of that. But before we get into that, I'd love for you to get the opportunity to share what made you want to dive into the leadership and performance world.
So for me, it all started with myself, to be completely honest. Back in 2019, I was in a tough space and I was having a tough time. And I started diving into the realms of self-improvement. I started diving into the realms of mental fitness, meditation. And I started with meditation. And one of the books I read really just started to change my mindset on everything. So after being in a tough spot, I started to see the effects and how it could change my life. And so I was meditating every single day for an hour every single morning. And then over time, I started to figure out what worked for me through trial and error. People started to realize and see the changes in myself in 2020. And that's when more and more people started asking me, hey, can you coach my children? Can you coach me? Can you coach some of my friends as we go through? So it kind of just happened all together. And then from there, I realized more and more people were kind of coaxing me into saying, hey, you should put a lot of this information online because I think more and more people could really understand and grab this information and take it and run with it. So it just kind of happened all together in terms of my own transformation and what I've been learning and sharing. And that's where I think of myself. You use the word consultant, but I think of myself as a mix of consultant, practitioner, journalist, and researcher, kind of all smushed into one.
Right. You're wearing all these different hats, and
Yep.
Your journey kind of sparked obviously this desire to want to learn more. And then once you kind of learn more about these aspects of self-improvement and meditation and mental fitness and self-awareness, you want to continue to expand on and teach. And so, when you're kind of exploring that kind of, mindset of wanting to teach and give back, what has the journey been like? How have you really learned how to, number one, like consume the content of kind of mental fitness and performance to then want to teach the concept, and how have you evolved as a teacher over time?
So I've definitely gotten better as a teacher over time. I think at the beginning, it all starts with the humility to understand that you don't know every answer and you have to start asking the right questions. That's really where it starts out with in terms of what am I looking for? Why am I looking for it? And starting with those questions that go along with it. When I start working with someone, I think the biggest thing is talking about what the most important things are for them. What are your goals? What's your vision? And really, what's the identity that starts in the middle that we need to be thinking about in terms of building? It really all starts with self-awareness. I think the principle of self-awareness, it all starts at that core, because as you start to grow the muscle of self-awareness, you start to understand what is it I want. You start getting better at how you focus. You start getting better at being able to eliminate distractions, and then also have a vision and start heading it towards a plan of what you need to go through. So for me, it kind of started with that. And then when I sit down and work with people, it's really getting to know them. I can't, I know what's worked for me in my life in terms of the principles of goal setting, the principles of journaling and meditation and being able to be present. But that means something different to everyone in terms of what it is. For me, I think you need to have presence, you need to have self awareness. But for some people, it might actually just be going outside and walking for 15 minutes and getting outside nature. For some people, it might say, hey, I need to shut the lights off. I need to sit cross legged and I'm going to do a meditation in the dark as we go through. The principles are the same in terms of getting to know yourself, being able to focus and be present better. But how you execute on it depends on who you are and what you enjoy. And that's where, to me, I need to understand you. I need to ask those questions. I need to see what are those triggers and what do we need to be working on as well.
That's a great kind of way and framework to look at it, and just kind of giving everyone their own guidelines on how they can execute that mindfulness. It doesn't have to be, sitting in the dark and doing the 10 minutes of meditation, right? You can be someone like, I really enjoy going on walks and just either clearing my mind or like trying to think about nothing and just listening to the sounds and being outside. And I like how you kind of view it as self-awareness as a muscle. So as you know, I feel like a lot of times coaches, we understand, right? More reps, right? The better you get at something, right? If you're just going to put it in simple terms. So for as a coach and someone who really cares about developing the minds of young people, and for the coaches that are listening, what are some like ways we can help our athletes develop that self-awareness and, do those bicep curls of self-awareness?
Yep. So the first thing is how do you build a consistent process into what you are doing every single day? So I think one of the things that most people do is they try to do a big fell swoop type of thing where, hey, we're going to do an hour on what meditation means, or we're going to do an hour on this day. And then you're not really using the principle of reinforcement to reinforce those different activities. That's why it's better for you to start small and start with how can we do a consistent habit. So one of the things I've worked with coaches on is to say, hey, we know that we're going to do 5 minutes every single day on a new topic, or we're going to do 5 minutes on how we begin and end every single practice, every single meeting with certain new things that we go through. Maybe it doesn't need to be 5 minutes. Maybe you want to start out with 1 to 2 minutes to keep it simple. But that's where you can use that time to reinforce whatever it is that you need to go through. So as a coach, you might want to be reinforcing your culture. You might want to be reinforcing the wins that you have for the day. Or if your new theme is, hey, we need to be present as we start to go through it, okay, let's do a mindfulness minute for 1 minute as we go through. So I think about how are you beginning and ending your practice, because that's the things that people are going to remember the most. So let's talk about maybe one of the things I've worked with coaches on before is what are your core values and how are you actually embedding them into the practice and into what you do? Because say being present and being mindful is the most important thing. So are we doing something at the beginning to have that mindful moment? And then at the end of practice, are we then saying, hey, let's do another mindful moment, or say, hey, everyone stop for a second and think about what was one great moment that you had during this practice, how we're taking that moment to be mindful, but we're bringing in gratitude into that moment as well. So thinking about how you can bring it in. And to be honest, coaches nowadays have to be more creative than ever in terms of getting into young kids' minds and getting their attention overall. So maybe it does mean bringing a video in. Maybe it is having a speech from Nick Saban or Sean McVay or Steve Kerr, depending on who relates to the people as well. But having those consistency, I think, is the best thing as you start to think about the habits.
That makes a ton of sense. So just to kind of break it down. So if I want to teach my athletes, right, like I'm big on asking questions. I generally like to ask at the end of each session, and sometimes I'll ask different questions, but they're all a series of reflections, right? The most common one I'll ask is, what did you improve on today? Or what did you do well today? What do you what do you want to continue improving on? And then I'll just kind of ask a variety of questions based on the end, in order to kind of help that self-awareness. What other, like, could you give examples or additional examples of activities to help athletes, kind of continue to build that self-awareness?
There's a few things. So number one, if you look at Olympic athletes, one of the things they're really good at is their performance journals. So one of the things as an athlete you need to do is you need to stop listening to yourself so much. I mean, you absolutely need to listen to yourself because that's one of the core things of self awareness. But I think more and more we need to learn how to talk to ourselves. How do we best listen to ourselves? Is it actually going out and saying things to myself? Is it writing it down and having my mantras and those different things that I have that are going to be said? So, for example, when you were mentioning, hey, we at the end, I want people to reflect on what were their wins for the day. I want them to reflect on what they won. By doing that, especially if you write it down as well, you start to use a different part of the brain to actually have it recorded into your brain because you're saying it out loud, you're thinking it, and then you're also writing it. But also you have a history of it to go back to think about what did you have during that day in terms of your performance. So you're starting to build confidence because you see the growth of what was happening. Each day, when you think about your wins, you have those big wins you've always had. But if you keep accumulating wins every single day by asking that question, which is, I think, a great question to ask, you're accumulating win after win as you go through. So when you think about a performance journal, it's a little bit more than just a diary. I think you can use it to have a diary to say, hey, how am I feeling? What am I doing? But also, I think of it more as how are you bringing your goals into that in terms of your goal setting? How are you bringing the talking to yourself in terms of those affirmations? But also, how are you bringing in visualization that goes into it as well? So it's kind of a history that you're building upon yourself. That's a great habit. It's a tough one to start because I know people don't like to sit down and write, but it's a very valuable one as you go through because to be honest, just like anything else in life, if you start a habit and you do it for a while, you learn that the more I do hard things, the more I can do other hard things in life. It's very much
Absolutely. And, just to talk about performance journaling, I've been journaling, I think, since inconsistently my first couple of years of college, but like consistently since my junior year of college, which is 2018, 2019. And that stuck with me and that's helped me kind of learn from myself. So I know that journaling is a big one for me that's really helpful. But I think one of the things that you talked about is it's more than just a diary, right? And so you're talking about bringing your goals into it and then self-talk and visualization. Now, I think, obviously as coaches, we've done some goal setting with our players, but is there like specific ways, that you do goal setting with your athletes?
Yes. So it depends on the person, to be completely
Right.
honest. So there's usually in life there's a mix of people, but usually people are one or the other. They're very process focused or they are goal focused. So if you're going to put someone like I know I'm working with someone right now that is they need to be talking about what that end goal is for the end of the year in terms of like that is the big goal that they're going through. And so that's where it always goes back to that big goal. That's the reminder in terms of the why and the communication that overall goes in. There are people that are more process focused in terms of they can actually take that big goal and break it down into those bite sized consumable pieces. Regardless of what it is in terms of how you set your goals, setting them whether they are process goals or big goals, I think the key thing you need to do is you need to reflect and reiterate every week and every 3 weeks. So as you start to think about the big goal, you're going to set your big goals for the end of the year. But how can we break them down into wins that we can either be setting every single day or setting for a week or 2 to 3 weeks down the line? And as we go through, reflecting on, is this really getting me to where I want to be in terms of what the process goal is? So let's just keep it simple and generalized for someone in terms of like, I need to get better at basketball. I need to get better at shooting in terms of I want to be able to be the best, be the best shooter on the team. Well, what do you need to be doing every single day? What is the process and daily goal? Well, I want to hit 100 free throws every single day. I want to hit 100 3-pointers every single day. And I want to hit 100 shots off the dribble every single day. Obviously, there's a lot more detail that we can get into in terms of the mechanics of it and everything else. But let's keep it simple. That's the process goal of what you're doing. Then think about how you're doing every single day so the performance journal can come into this and say, well, it took me this long to make this many shots. I was usually hitting them too far to the right or too I was overshooting them overall in terms of maybe hitting the back rim. So now I'm reflecting on it every single day. Go back and say, okay, are these the process goals? Now that we've been doing this for 21 days, are these the process goals that I need to be thinking about more? Actually, I'm noticing in games, I'm shooting a lot more floaters, or I'm shooting a lot more on the run. Now I need to be bringing those into how I'm shooting. So maybe we adjust the numbers as we go through. I think the problem that most people have is they set the big goal at the end. They don't think about the process and the consistency that is going to get me there. And they're not reflecting along the way, because it truly is an iterative process. And it goes back to the self awareness and asking yourself the hard questions of, am I really doing what I need to be doing to get to where I need to go overall as we go through? So I think it goes back to the consistency. We were talking about it on a team level, but as a one-on-one level, how do I think about consistently doing what I need to do every single day and just making it more of a
Absolutely. And I like this idea, and so I kind of have a follow-up question around talking about resilience, and especially when it comes to a training plan for a specific goal. How what are good questions, and how do we help our athletes, and if you have any stories to share on, do we keep going on this, like say I'm having a roadblock, right? Like I'm, we'll keep it simple with threes, right? I'm not making as many threes in a game as I would like, right? When does it become like resilience kind of work, like in terms of the mindset? And when does it become, maybe I need to adjust and change my training plan?
It depends on your goal and kind of where you're trying to fit in. So like the question I would
Right.
ask there is, well, why do we need to change the training plan right now? Like what are you actually getting at in terms of what the overall goal is? The goal to be the better shooter, or is the goal to stay on the court in terms of what needs to get done?
Mm,
And that's where you need to balance, what do I need to do to help the team, help myself, while also not harming anything that goes in along through there. And so for the example I would say is, let's ask questions of, why do you think why do you think that you're not hitting those threes in the games? Is it because you're not preparing? Is it because you're getting a little bit of performance anxiety every single time you do shoot those threes? Is it the fact that maybe you're just not strong enough at this point in terms of kind of your delivery and your shot? Your legs are getting tired as we go through at the game. So I start to ask the questions of, where do we think we're headed? And then what is the goal of what we need to accomplish? Because you're right. Maybe in this instance, we do need to change the goal and adjust, where it's say, hey, during the games, maybe I should be reflecting a little bit more on where my strength and my power is. And maybe I need to be working on this in practice. And until I feel more confident, we start to bring it down as we go through. So the word resilience, I would say here, is more of, hey, we're going to have endurance no matter what. We're going to ultimately get to where we need to go. It might just take a little bit longer in terms of resetting and managing those expectations that we go in. And that's where the expectations kind of fit into kind of where it kind of, I don't want to say messes up, but it starts to reflect into kind of where you're asking the right questions as you go through in terms of what is the overall goal of what we need to go through. Because if your expectation is just to help the team, then at the end of the day, why are we talking about threes and twos? How can we help the team in terms of, hey, let's just try to make as many shots as we possibly can?
right. Right. No, that's a really good point. Just bringing it back to kind of the overall goal. Now, I kind of want to stay on the topic of resilience and kind of bring up a point that you talked about earlier, which is the more challenging aspects we go through in life, right? The more confident we become at being able to overcome certain obstacles. So I'd love for you to kind of just share just resilience tips for athletes that you go through. I know you just wrote a newsletter on the 9 things that the most resilient athletes execute on.
Yeah. So I was working with someone last month, and I think the biggest thing when it comes to resilience is, how are you defining what you are going through, and then how are you focusing that goes along with it. So, for example, when we start defining it, we need to start thinking about, like, there's a few things I wrote in that newsletter. Is just like, how do we just think about failure? How do we think about resilience and endurance? How do we think about just how life is, in terms of, sometimes, like, stuff happens. You know, you have to accept that stuff happens in life, and how are you going to bounce back from it? You can't always control the environment, but I can control my attitude and my energy and my emotion that goes into different things. So the first thing I worked with this person on was, how are we thinking about just this in general, in terms of accepting that things are always going to happen. They're not going to go according to plan, but I can choose to build resilience as I go through it. So we're starting to change the beliefs and the core at the front end. The next piece is, okay, we need to work on where we are focusing our attention, in terms of knowing that, hey, I need to eliminate the distraction. So the key question that is rooted in all of this is, your mind is going to go to those bad thoughts in terms of like, hey, I didn't make the team, or I didn't do this, or I didn't do that. And so this was someone that in their mind they had a pretty big failure. But at the end of the day, they kept harping on it. Their mind kept going into it in terms of different triggers were going to it and different things were happening. But at the end of the day, you have to ask the question, when I start thinking about this and my mind starts going to that, is this helping me or is this harming me? So how can we set a plan to say, okay, this isn't helping me. How can I actually trigger and go to something that is going to be helping me overall? Because this is harming me. It's getting me in a bad mood every single time I think about it. It's making me focus in ways that I don't truly want to. So going there, and then starting to think about, okay, as I start to focus, like making sure that I'm talking to myself versus just listening to everything that goes on, as I start to think about, is this harming me? And then knowing that this isn't permanent. I'm going to get over this. So having that belief as I talk to it, this isn't going to pervade into other areas of my life as well. And so it's not going to be constant as we go through it. So to me, it's the little habits of resilience that help you is just being able to have that self-awareness. So that's where meditation, being present, focusing on the moment, being able to truly be where your feet are is the best thing that's going to help you go through resilience, because you'll understand and remind yourself all those things we just talked about, in terms of talk to yourself about, accept that stuff's going to happen. It's not going to go the right way, but I can focus and control on what I can control. And then the self-awareness, as it goes through, my mind keeps wandering. How do I get myself back to those different things? How do I run through? And you think about it, I think about it sometimes, it's like I've already pre-programmed these computer programs into my mind to say, when that trigger happens again, and I think about my failure, and this is what we were talking about, the three things I'm going to do is I'm going to be aware of it. I'm going to tell myself my one sentence that makes me feel comfortable. And then I'm going to focus on what I'm doing right now in terms of, we are having this conversation.
Gotcha. And that's all just self-process, self-awareness oriented.
Yep.
And you talked about failure, and I want to get there here in a second, but can you kind of give an example of, something, some sort of trigger that may cause someone to be upset, and then also an example of what kind of sentence can help them?
So let's think about a basketball player, and let's think about like missing a shot, and that in terms of like, hey, every time I miss a shot, my mind immediately goes to the worst place possible. I'm the worst shooter in the world. So as you start to go through, there's different times throughout the game, obviously, when you miss the shot. How can I just say, hey, I've practiced this. I know this. I'm going to be great at this as you go through. And every sentence you create is going to be a little bit different, but you need to start talking to yourself in more of a positive manner, and also think about the fact that you've done the work at this point. This is where preparation becomes so helpful, because you feel like you've earned it in a way. And that's where it starts to help as you go through it. So when I've worked with shooters in the past, for example, and they're trying to get their confidence up, and let's say they're having trouble with the confidence, and like they just get on the court and they see other people, and they see like other people making all those shots. They got to build the self-awareness to understand that their self-talk is saying to them, hey, you're never going to be as good as them, or they're a really good shooter. And that's where it goes in. And I go back to the habits and say, well, let's reword that. Number one, I'm aware of what I just said to myself. But number two, I'm going to have that program and say, this is what I'm going to say to myself. I shot 1,000 shots every single day for the last 6 months. I've earned the work I have. I know I'm a good shooter. It's going to come out in the games.
Right. Having that the data, right? The data that you've done it, right? The preparation is the proof, and then kind of, obviously re re I don't want to say reinstating, but repeating that to yourself over and over again
Yeah.
is just a way kind of to do so talking about, just to finish the point, like the physical work is the shooting itself, and then the
Yep.
mental work is the self-talk, correct?
Exactly. Exactly. And that's where just a few ways to like get yourself out of a funk is your mood is going to follow your action. And so that's where the preparation and doing the action becomes so helpful because it gives you something to rely on and give yourself proof of what you have done in the past. So that way it's like, well, I've already done this. I know it's going to start working. And that's where people, this is where, in terms of like positive self talk and positive psychology, like if you're just positive for the sake of being positive, this is where you lose people because it's not rooted in realism. It's not rooted in your environment and what's truly going on. That's why when you pair the positive self talk with action, you start to really see a synergistic effect that goes up because you know you've done the work, you know you've taken action, and you feel confidence in yourself. Because if you're saying, hey, I'm the best shooter in the world, but you haven't shot a shot in the last week or you haven't done anything, you're just lying to yourself. And to be honest, you're eroding the trust you have with yourself because you're not going to believe yourself at the end of the day. That's where the action helps you start to practice and prepare. And that's where, in terms of visualizing your future, knowing that you're doing the work as you're doing the actual physical work as you're doing the mental work is helping you as you go through.
Right. No one can be the best shooter in the world, even if you're best shooter up here, but if you never take a shot, right? Yeah, that you have to perform the action over and over and over again to be great at something. And, obviously there's a lot more performance aspects we can go in, but I want to
Exactly.
keep it on talking about kind of failure, and jump ship to talking about failure, because I know for me as a coach, this is definitely, something that I see a lot in my young athletes, especially high school athletes, right? And it's with all athletes, but kind of giving perspective on my thoughts on what, especially during the high school season, versus club. So high school season, I had more athletes that were afraid of failure because their peers were watching them. So I coached the freshman, sophomore team. They want to look good for JV and the varsity. All those players, they want to impress them, and they also want to impress the varsity coach, right? So trying to impress the people around them, and at high school, they're at that age where they're very impressionable, right? So kind of keeping that in mind, and I know that you work with youth athletes, how do you help them navigate failure, and building a better relationship with it?
Yeah. So I was working with a high school swimmer. And when it comes to fear of failure, I think the biggest things that he and I had to have a conversation about was just what is failure and really defining what is failure and what a failure actually looks like. And so then going into the conversation of, hey, anyone who has failed at anyone who's been successful in anything has failed at something in their lives. And I put failed as air quotes because, to be honest, they learned from it. They grew from it as you go through it. So starting to have that conversation of saying, okay, let's start to change the wording and the language that goes along with it. I think one of the big things that you and I are talking about right now is the language that goes into the conversation we have with other people, the language we have that goes into the conversation that we have with ourselves. The next thing that we sat down and did was let's go through and actually let's do a fear setting exercise. What is the worst thing that truly happens? Let's think of like 10 out of 10, the worst thing that happens, and go through and actually say, how bad is that on a level of 1 to 10, in terms of 10 being dying as we go through it? So, what is the actual fear that we have that's going on? And then going into it and thinking about it probabilistically. So, actually throwing a percentage and saying, what are the percent chances that that actually happens? And I think one of the things we started to go through, and this is a muscle that you build with self awareness, was you lie to yourself a lot in terms of your thoughts that you have. And that's why talking to yourself becomes so important because you need to challenge those negative thoughts. So he and I were having this conversation and he was like, well, this, that, and the other. And I go, is that true? And that's a good question to just ask yourself. Is that really true? And how do you know it to be true? And that was the conversation that we kept going back to in terms of he'd say something and I'd say, is that true? How do you know that? And so we'd go through it and we had kind of a full sheet of paper that said all the fears, the percentage that happened as we went through it. And then we went to the back side of the paper and we said, okay, well, what are the good things that can happen? Let's go out and let's actually say, what are the good things that are going to happen if you go out for the team? What are the good things that are going to happen if you start winning? What are the good things that are going to happen in terms of college scholarships that go along with it, in terms of kind of thinking out into the future? And so what we had to do, if I kind of give that example and we bring it back to what we just talked about. Number one, we framed a conversation around what is failure and how are you defining failure. Number two, we quantified it. We didn't make it so scary in terms of, wow, is it really going to be that bad? Like in the example that you gave in terms of, hey, I don't want to fail in front of I don't want to look like an idiot in front of my college coaches or in front of my high school coaches as well. Thinking about that and thinking about, well, if that does happen, you'll get another chance, especially if you're a freshman or a sophomore. You'll get more opportunities as we go through. And if that is your failure point, then okay, how can we prepare so that doesn't happen? What can we think about in terms of you can always control how many charges did you actually take that game? How are you thinking about in terms of like being aggressive? Because there are other things that they will look at overall in terms of your actual mindset. So now how can we actually challenge those as we go through in terms of quantifying it? And then the third step, challenging it. And then fourth, let's think about being a little positive as we go through the entire process as well. So we list the fears, we quantify them, we challenge them, and then we think.
I like that. And I also, one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about as I hear you talk is about, one of the things is, right, kind of challenging, right, our thoughts around those failures. How much do you feel like failure and this fear of failure has something to do with how we view success? Because I feel like that's sometimes what I see with young athletes, right? They feel like a success is, right, scoring 20 points and 10 rebounds, like some things that are a little bit unrealistic, right, for a youth basketball game versus, you're comparing yourself to elite players in the professional world, which is a lot of times what, athletes are comparing themselves to.
Absolutely. I think you kind of hit on it with that word comparison. I think comparison right now is very rampant across all age groups, just in the world that we live in today. And that makes it difficult for us to think about how are we defining success and really grounding it in realism. And that's where I would have the conversation of saying, okay, my goal is to have 20 points per game this year. And I'd say, okay, that's a great goal for you to have. It's specific. You know exactly what it is. But what are the percent chances that you actually have it? How many times have you scored 20 points per game in previous years? Even when maybe you were a lower level, how many times did you actually do that? So starting to ask the questions and having them challenge themselves as well. And that's where, if we go back to the goal setting, if that was your original goal, maybe we need to reflect on the goal and make it a little bit more realistic as we go into that 21-day pattern of what you have as well. We talked about losing trust with yourself. If you set a goal that is so high that you're not going to be able to achieve it, you're going to also start to lose trust with yourself as well, because it's going to be way too unrealistic. It's going to be demotivating as you go through. You want things that are above where you are today, but not easily attainable, but you don't want things that are too completely unrealistic on what you are trying to accomplish. And that's where sometimes you need to challenge, is this realistic? And just asking that question and then putting the percentage that goes along with it. What I've seen is that when you work with people and you start to put numbers on what this is actually going to happen, and then ask the question, do you really feel that to be true? They start to level out in terms of those different ways, in terms of some people, it's kind of like the Goldilocks theory. Some people underestimate it. Some people completely overestimate it, where we need to find it where it's just about right.
Gotcha. No, that makes a ton of sense. And, I think having the 21-day pattern, because I've also seen, as doing goal setting with athletes, especially in the last week of camp, right? You see certain lofty aspirations, which are not a bad thing, but I think also kind of making sure that they're realistic and that they're stretch goals, right? They're not break the rubber band goals where it's a slingshot all the way to the front, right? Because I think that's what we kind of are imagining, and it's challenging, right? When we're on social media and we see, now, I mean, now everyone my age is a professional athlete, and I'm like, oh my goodness, right? I've compared myself before to coaches my age with, similar businesses, and it's like, oh well, they're this age, I should have, but getting back to that, I think just recognizing and setting those realistic goals are incredibly helpful.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So as we kind of, enter the fourth quarter, the last couple innings of our podcast, I really would like to kind of, what questions have I not asked that I should be asking my athletes, or would like to tell coaches that are helping athletes on how they can develop better performance in game through self-awareness?
So I think we talked about a lot of great things in terms of kind of the different processes and kind of ways to think about it. I guess the next thing I would think about is like, as we go through and we break down really three different things that we were talking about. We talked about the fundamentals of self-awareness. We talked about the fundamentals of focus and concentration, and we talked about it in a resilience aspect. But we could talk about it more in terms of like, how am I being fully concentrated on what I need to, eliminating the distractions of comparison and doing what I need to do. And then the third step of, how am I thinking about my vision, my goal, and really embedding this all into the identity of what I have. And so I think about this process of saying, hey, self awareness, focus, and then goals and growth in terms of it. So if I think about it each day, I know everyone talks about like the each day, how do I get those wins? So here I would ask the question of, how are we helping you get a self awareness win every single day? How are we helping you get a focus win every single day? And how are we helping you get a growth win every single day? So those three different wins. And so how can I ask questions that are going to help you think about it in those different ways? So for self-awareness, how are you spending time just being present, or us talking about being present? Where was a moment where you actually realized, hey, I needed to do this on my shot, or I needed to do this in terms of those different things that we talked about? So how can I get that self-awareness win? How can I get a focus win? So how can I make sure that I'm fully focused and being present on what I am doing? How can I make sure that we are eliminating distractions? Or how am I just actually focusing on the positive of what I need in life? So a gratitude moment, or focusing on some of the great things that I need to be seeing online versus just looking at everything that's on Instagram. And then also the third thing is, how do I get a growth win? So what did I get better at? What did I work on? How am I growing every single week in terms of those different things? So those are kind of three key principles I would think about, because as you start building the muscle of self-awareness, building the muscle of focus and being able to get yourself focused on what you are doing, and then focusing on growth, you're going to start to see your confidence improve. You're going to start to see your performance improve. You're going to start to see a lot of things start skyrocketing because you're working and kind of focused on the triangle of growth.
That makes a ton of sense. And then just kind of to capture the point, would you say as obviously you do this more and more, then becomes a part of your identity? Can you talk about how kind of some of those visions and goals fit into a certain athlete's identity?
Yeah. So let's think about, I'll use the example. Actually, I'll use my example of myself. So in 2019, during that tough time, and kind of one of the wins I saw in 2020 was I couldn't run more than a quarter of a mile. I've had back problems since I was 16 years old. In 2020, my goal at the beginning of the year, I wrote it down, was to be able to start running. Didn't really have anything specific. It was just start running. Well, 2020 and COVID happened, and all the gyms are shut down, and you don't really have any options. And remember, I couldn't run more than a quarter of a mile, couldn't run more than a lap around the track because I had back problems. Well, more and more, I started to get better. I'd be able to run and then walk and then run and then walk. And then by the end of the year, I was actually running 4 to 5 miles consistently without having to stop. Well, that continued. And in 2022, I ran my first half marathon. And then in 2023, I ran my first marathon. And so when I talk about my identity as we go through, what I started to realize was, number one, at the beginning, it sucked. I mean, having to only, I ran for like 30 seconds and then I'd have to walk for 30 seconds, run and then walk as we go through. But as you start to act more and more on it and start to think about it, you start to change the identity of who you are, because you are kind of changing the habits and the persona of what your identity truly is. And this is where I started to increase what my goals were. Now it was like, I'm going to run a mile without stopping. I'm going to run 2 miles without stopping. And it wasn't a straight line. There's ups, there's downs.
Right.
I injured myself twice in between. You keep going and you figure out what works for you. But being able to know, hey, I'm having enjoyment and passion for what I'm doing helped me get there along the way. But also, I now categorize myself as a runner in terms of, hey, it became a part of my identity. I enjoy running as we go through. So that's where I had the goal. I didn't really have the vision of becoming a runner, but it became who I was because it was something I was doing consistently as you go through. And that's where, as you start to build out habits, you notice after 4 to 6 weeks, you notice some of the changes start to come in. You notice what happens. For meditation, the biggest thing people say is not, hey, when I meditated today, I felt 100 times better. It's when they stop meditating that they're like, wow, I noticed the difference because I couldn't focus. I was frantic. I was all over here as you go through. So you start to notice the difference of when you don't do it. And I go back to, I mean, we've been talking about shooting and basketball for a lot. If you go out and you start practicing every single day and you stop for 3 or 4 days, you'll notice it takes you a little bit while to get back on it as well in terms of your identity of who you do. And so one of the things I said was I'm a runner. I try not to categorize myself, but I try to categorize myself as kind of the habits and what I do in terms of like, I'm a person who commits to what they do. I choose mindfulness every single day. I choose happiness and joy of what I do. And I'm a person of integrity as we go through. And that's where one of the things as we start to think about the identity, it's the why of what you're doing. But think about your core values as a human being, your core values as a team, and how are you embodying that to yourself as well. So it's something you can always lean on as part of your identity.
I love that. And that's like a perfect place, a perfect, kind of ribbon on the podcast. And, just talking about how all these things coming together, right? And you're talking about over time. I think it's great, in 2019, right, was the challenge. And 2020 was when you started crawling, so to speak, right? Started just walking, running, doing whatever you could. And then in 2023, you're running a full marathon. And I think that's also kind of, obviously it's a full circle. It's a great moment because I think especially for this generation of athletes, I just wrote a newsletter about it last week, is it's so important to stay patient and play the kind of the long game of development, that, you're not going to become a shooter in 3 months, 6 months, a year. It's years of work, of walking, running, getting injured, getting back, and continuing to go and process and push forward. So, before I ask you to share how our coaches and listeners can find you, are there any last pieces of wisdom and advice you want to bridge impact to our listeners?
Yep. So two things I got for you. Number one, for those of you who are basketball fans, I would say go look up Stephen Curry's documentary.
Yes.
When you were just talking, I mean, the biggest thing I think we have is we live in a world right now that wants instant gratification, but the meaning of patience isn't just sitting and waiting. It's doing
Right.
what you can while delaying that gratification that goes along with it. And the reason I say go watch the documentary is because, to be completely honest, at 16 years old, he had to redo his shot, which is one of the most painful things you could do in terms of changing out everything and being able to really change the mechanics and how far you were going. But also, you look at his first game, and we talked about resilience. I think he had 12 turnovers in his first game. He barely made any shots, and the coach stayed with him in his next game. I think he had over 30 points in that next game as well. So having the confidence and kind of yourself and what you've been doing as part of the action. So it's a really good example and a really good story for those of you out there. So definitely take a look at his documentary. And then the second thing is one of the books that I would absolutely that I suggest to everyone is called With Winning in Mind by Lanny Bassett. One of the best books you could have about actually setting a mental performance plan. I talked about performance journaling. He'll talk about the difference between a performance journal and a diary. He'll talk about how you actually set up the different phases of what you're doing. So very useful for people who are in golf or tennis. But to be honest, in basketball, if you think about shots, or football in terms of setting up before the huddle, and everything you need from a mental performance mindset. And he's an Olympic gold winner. He really set the bar when it came to where he felt choking in the 1972 Olympics, where I think he got silver, but then winning it in gold in 1976 as well. So definitely a great book that I would suggest to anyone, and definitely one that I'd gift out to a lot of people.
Love that. So we got the Unranked documentary, that's Curry's documentary. I believe that's on Apple. And then With Winning in Mind is the book recommendation. So, Coach AJ, where can people find you on the internet?
Yep. So you can find me on Twitter. It's Coach AJ Kings. I post there probably 2 to 3 times per day. It's usually a nice little long post in the morning, a blog post, and then videos and other things throughout the rest of the day. And then I have a weekly newsletter that is called The Growth Compass. So you can go on thegrowthcompass.beehive.com and sign up there. We've got a free version, and then we've got a premium version. Free version, you can sign up. You get a newsletter every single week where I'll talk about a lot of these different topics. And then the premium version is a premium community that we have set up where it's a daily newsletter. And then we also have all the daily content gets put into a database for you. So it's a full community where you can actually go up and search and look for any of the information and insights that have been building and growing over time. So feel free to take a look at both of those. Very useful for coaches, parents, teachers, and athletes in terms of thinking about mental performance, thinking about the process of what I need to do, from self-awareness to focus to goal setting to visualization, all these topics we talk.
Love that. Thank you so much for your time today, Coach.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast. We'd love it if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment and a review on whatever platform you're on. It's the best way to help us grow. We appreciate you for doing that. We'll shout you out on social media. I'd also love if you connected with me on social media. Let me know your thoughts. And this is why I do it. I want to share knowledge and wisdom from experienced leaders to people like yourself and myself, so we can have this dialogue and move forward, make an impact on the world. So stay tuned, stay subscribed. Cheers.